Good evening. I am thankful to be here. I have preached a wedding here before, and I have visited here for your gospel meetings, but this is my first time preaching. And I would have come sooner, but I didn't really want to be around Chad Dollahide or Aaron Stice, and so I had to wait until they were both gone. So finally they are gone, and I can come and be with you. So I'm excited to be here tonight. At Oak Hill this year, we are doing something that I think is very helpful and very healthy. I don't know about you and your personal studies, but sometimes I have a problem of getting too deep into a topic or too deep into a book, and so I may know everything that there is about it, but I lose focus on what's most important. I don't let the main thing be the main thing, if you know what I mean. And so I might lose my focus a little bit on Jesus. Even though I'm reading the Scriptures, I forget to focus on what's most important. And so this year at Oak Hill, we're doing kind of a reset on all of our classes, and we're spending the entire year focusing just on the life of Jesus, what He did in creation, what happened when He was born, the things that He did between those two times, the things He did in His ministry, and even the things that He's doing for us now. And so each of our adult Bible classes will be combined, and we're looking at the life of Christ. And even our teenage classes are spending the whole year looking at the life of Christ. And so another thing that we did is we bought a copy of this book. I don't know if you've seen this, but I want to recommend it to you. We've bought a copy of this book called His Life for each of the families in our congregation. And it is a daily devotional that focuses on different aspects of the life of Christ. Some of the writers are David Shannon, Kyle Butt, Larry Acuff, among others. But it's a very good book. And so that's what we're doing at Oak Hill this year. And so I'll be teaching part of that class to our adults later in the year. And so I've already started my studies along that way, and I wanted to share with you some of the things that I've learned so far. I want you to think about this. What would you do if you knew that you only had 1 week to live? You know, we never know how much time we have to live. We never know if Jesus is going to come back even right now. But if you knew for sure you had 1 week to live, how would you spend that week? I thought about that a good deal today. And, you know, I really thought briefly about eating my favorite foods or doing something fun. But quickly that gave way to the things I think I would really spend my time doing. I thought about how much time I would spend with my family. I would not be as available by phone or by text message or email because I would be focusing on my kids and on my wife, on my mom, on my closest friends. And not only that, but I would be not just trying to make new memories for them, but I would be preparing them for me leaving. I would try to make this world more acceptable when I'm gone, and I would try to teach them a few things and share a few things. And not only that, the last thing that I could think of that I for sure would do is I would try to study with people one more time that I've tried before and they've just shown no interest. You know, I might even guilt them into it. Come on, I've only got a week left. Would you at least listen to me? And I would try to share the gospel and share the truth with them. Now, when we look at the end of Jesus' life, we can walk through Scripture and see what it is that Jesus did with that last week of His life. You know, if you took the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you crammed them together, 1/3 of that is about just the last week of Jesus' life. You know, we're told if we had a record of everything that Jesus ever did, the world couldn't contain the books. And I think that means not just that the world wouldn't hold the inspired accounts of it, but also it wouldn't hold our notes on it, our commentary, our thoughts. You go into a bookstore today or a library and look at the religious section, and how many books are there? And that's only on about 40 days of Jesus' life. If we had information for everything that He did, literally the world probably couldn't contain the books. Not only the inspired volumes, but what we've had to say about it. But if you look at the last week of Jesus' life, you see 1/3 of what we're told about Him, and you see how He spent those last few days. And so that's what I want us to do tonight. So open up to Matthew chapter 21, if you will. And we will pull in some information from Mark, Luke, and John, but we'll mainly march through Matthew chapter 21 starting, and then we'll get as far as we can get. And we'll start this week and finish next week. But this is often referred to as Jesus' Passion Week. Have you ever heard that term, the Passion? Maybe you saw the movie that Mel Gibson directed, the Passion of Christ. Maybe you've heard of passion plays. When I think of passion, I think really of just enjoyment, right? When someone has a passion, a zeal for life, they really enjoy it. But passion here really means suffering. Okay, so when we think about the passion of Christ, what we're thinking about is that submissive suffering that He went through. And so this Passion Week, this final week, is Jesus' last week on earth. When Jesus knew He was about to be killed, how did He spend that final week? Well, believe it or not, He spent it much like I would. And he spent it much like you probably would too. He spent time with those closest to him. He prepared them for his death, and then he tried to do some more teaching in his final days. So the last week of Jesus' life, it's so important. So much of the Gospels are focused on it. And as we read it, as we read the end of each Gospel, we're able to walk through and see Jesus' last days. We're able to be with him as he enters Jerusalem. We're able to be with him as he teaches in the temple. We're able to stand at the foot of the cross as we look up, and we're able to stand beside his empty tomb. And as we read through the Bible, the crucifixion, the death, burial, and resurrection, his life, this final week, is really what the whole Bible focuses on and either looks forward to or looks back to. And for the life of the Christian, this is really the heart of our life. The heart of our beliefs is this resurrection of Christ after his death. So here's what I want us to get out of the study for these next 2 weeks, at least a couple of things. The first thing is I just want us to understand a timeline of Jesus' last week. What did that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so on and so forth look like? What was the timeline? And then second of all, I want you and I to think about the time that we have left. It may be a lot of time or it may not be much, but how should we spend that time? And then finally, what I really want us to get is, I want us to appreciate what Jesus did, not only in his life, but in this last week, what he did for us. And I want us to appreciate that. Now, as we go through this, I want to get volunteers to read for a few reasons, just to make sure we're all on the same page so you can hear some different voices. But I want to ask you as you read it slow as you read out loud, and read it like you're reading to an audience that's never heard it before. We have no real deadline to finish. We're not trying to finish the verse and read it quickly, but we want to read it slowly with understanding. So we understand it as we read it, and so those that hear it understand it. So the first verse I want to get someone to read, I'll hand these two out kind of back to back. Will someone read Philippians chapter 2 and verse 7 for us? Who will get that? Philippians chapter 2 and verse 7, okay, on the front. And then the second one, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 9. Who will get that one? 2 Corinthians 8, 9. All right. So we'll read these two kind of back to back.
Philippians 2, verse 7. I'll go back to verse 5. After this mind of you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who existed in the form of God, counted not being in equality with God, things to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of men.
Okay, thank you. Now 2 Corinthians 8, 9. Okay, so Jesus emptied himself, and though he was rich, he became poor. When you think about Jesus when he was born, if he had been born into the world's finest palace in the prettiest place that we've ever seen on this earth, that would have been a downgrade for him. But he wasn't born into those conditions. We know that he was born into a small town. He was born in a manger, so an area where animals would have been. And he was born to poor parents, humble parents without much money. So when Jesus entered this world, he did so humbly. And as we see Jesus enter this last week of his life, as he enters Jerusalem the same way that he had entered the world, humbly. Look with me at Matthew chapter 21, and we'll look at the start of the chapter, verses 1 through 3. It says, "And when they drew nigh unto Jerusalem, and were come to Bethpage, unto the Mount of Olives, then sent Jesus 2 disciples, saying unto them, Go into the village over against you, and straightway you'll find an ass tied and a colt with her. Loose them, and bring them unto me. And if any man say anything to you, you'll say, The Lord has need of them, and straightway he will send them." And so in Matthew chapter 21, Jesus tells these 2 disciples to find a donkey and a colt for his triumphal entering into Jerusalem. Now, Jesus is riding this donkey as a sign of humility. Even the humble act of riding a donkey, though, showed more than really meets the eye. I want to get somebody to read these 2 verses for us. Someone read 1 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 13. Who will get that one? 1 Samuel 6, 13. All right, Caleb, thank you. And read verse 20 as well. So 1 Samuel 16, 13 and 20. And then someone get 1 Kings 1, 38. Got that. All right. Thank you, Blake. All right, so we're thinking about the idea of Jesus, his humility shown on riding a donkey, but there was more to it than just humility. Jesus riding a donkey was also a claim to his kingship. And let's see that as a reflection in the Old Testament. Verses 13 and then also verse 20 after that. Okay, and then was that verse 20 as well? Okay, so you remember this story, and I think this is such an interesting story. Samuel has retired basically from being a prophet. He's so upset that Saul, God's chosen king, has gone astray, and he's really depressed about it. And so he basically says, I'm not prophesying, I'm not doing anything else. And God comes to him and says, basically, hey, get up and get over it. I've got another job for you. You're going to go anoint the next king. Go to the house of Jesse, and you'll be told who the next king is going to be. And so he goes to Jesse's house, and Jesse says to him, oh, well, great, one of my sons is going to be king. It's got to be this son. And Samuel says, no, not that one. He says, oh, well, I guess my next best guess would be this one. And Samuel says, no, not that one. And he goes son after son, and he says, well, I'm out of sons. And Samuel says, well, don't you have another son somewhere else? And he says, well, oh, yeah, I guess I do. I have David. And he says, well, okay, send for him and bring him here. Think about that from David's perspective. How depressing would that be if your parents were told, hey, one of your kids is going to be great, and your parents went through all of your brothers and sisters except you, and then when they got to the end, they said, well, that's it. Well, yeah, I guess it could be this kid. Well, that's what happened to David. So David would not have been Samuel's, would not have been Jesse's first pick, but he was God's pick. He was a man after God's own heart because he was a man of God's choosing. And so we see him in the verse Caleb read, verse 13, that he is anointed king. And look at verse 20. What happens to David? Where does he go? What does he do? He's told by Jesse to go visit his brothers at war. And what does he do? As soon as he becomes king, he gets on a donkey and rides it into the war. All right, now look at 1 Kings, or listen as Blake reads, 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 38. And we're talking about that next earthly king, Solomon. Okay, so as David's dying at the end of his life, who's going to be king? Who's going to take up the mantle? Which descendant of David? Well, it's going to be Solomon, and we know that looking back. But at the time, how were the people going to take Solomon's kingship seriously? How were they going to say, well, yeah, okay, we take that, we'll go with that guy, that's our guy? Well, one way that they did it is by showing his approval from David, by putting him on one of David's animals and riding him through town. So as we see Jesus entering Jerusalem, and we see him entering on a donkey, not only is he doing something humble, riding on a humble animal, but he's also making a subtle claim to his kingship. And just like David, the newly anointed king, rode on a donkey, just like Solomon, when he was appointed king, rode on a donkey, so now Jesus rides into Jerusalem triumphantly as the king on a donkey. And then look at Matthew chapter 21, verses 4 through 5. It says, all this was done. Well, what's the purpose behind all this? All this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, tell the daughter of Zion, behold, thy king cometh unto thee meek, humble, and sitting upon an ass, and a colt, the foal of an ass. So this was done to show Jesus' humility. This was done to show Jesus' kingship, and this was done to fulfill prophecy. So it's interesting to note, too, that no one had ever ridden this donkey before. And when we bring in Mark chapter 11, verse 2, and Luke chapter 19, verse 30, that adds to what Matthew has said, and we're told that no one's ever ridden this donkey. Caleb, you ever seen somebody try to ride an animal that's never been ridden before? How does that go? Usually not too well. The person ends up on the ground a lot of the times. They might end up with some bruises and some bumps. Well, did that happen to our king? No, he rode an animal that had never been ridden but didn't have a problem. Well, why? Well, Jesus is the creator. He is in control, and everything obeys Jesus. You know, it's interesting to me, people don't always obey Jesus. But when we look through the New Testament, we see that nature always does. You remember in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus is on the boat, And the storm comes up, and what does the storm do when Jesus says, "Peace, be still"? It obeys. You remember the fig tree in Matthew chapter 21, and we'll look at verse 19 in just a minute. Jesus pronounces a curse on it, and what does the fig tree do? It withers away. You remember John 21 and verse 6 as the apostles are fishing. Now, they had been fishing all night, and these were professional fishers. I imagine as they see someone come out to them and say, "Hey, why don't you cast your net on the other side?" Probably their initial thought is very smart aleck, very sarcastic. "Oh, yeah, okay, sure. I didn't think of that. Why don't I just fish on the other side of the boat?" But they do it. They listen to Jesus, and what do the fish do? They get in the net. Now, what has this donkey done? It's obeyed and listened to Jesus. So, no, people don't always obey, but every time Jesus talks to nature, it obeys. So by announcing his kingship, and Jesus comes in announcing his kingship in a public way, what Jesus is going to do is he's going to force people to make a decision about him. He's saying to people, either accept me as king or reject me and ultimately kill me. So as Jesus rides into town, look at verse 9. Jesus rides into Jerusalem. The crowds behind him and in front of him, they recognize his kingship, and they proclaim, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." If we bring in the other Gospels, they add this, "Blessed is the coming King of our father David. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. And blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel." So as Jesus comes into Jerusalem, is there any mistake how the people feel about him? Do they think he's just another man? Do they think he's just another prophet? They don't. The people before him and behind him announce and pronounce and accept his kingship. Now the Pharisees, when they hear this, you'll remember Luke chapter 19, verse 39, they privately call Jesus aside and they say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, teacher. Your disciples, these children, the people of Jerusalem, are calling you king. They're calling you God in the flesh. You need to correct them." And you remember what Jesus says? He says, "If I were to tell them to be quiet, the rocks that are around Jerusalem would cry out." So Jesus says, I can't tell them to be quiet. What they're saying is the truth. So Jesus knew he was the king. The people knew he was the king. The donkey that he was riding and the stones around Jerusalem even knew that he was the king. But the Pharisees, the religious rulers, those that should have known better, are the ones that rejected Jesus. Now you remember in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 14, Jesus has a situation where he heals on the Sabbath. Do you remember this? A man comes with a withered hand, and Jesus is about to heal this man, and the Pharisees get upset about it, and they say, "Whoa, who do you think you are healing on the Sabbath day?" And then Jesus explains to them, well, a couple of things. First, is it ever wrong to do right on the Sabbath day? No, it's not. But second of all, I have authority over the Sabbath. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And when Jesus does that, when he forgives the man of his sins, when he heals his hand, the Pharisees plot to kill Jesus. So this idea that he's being rejected, that people want to kill him, is nothing new. But it intensifies right before and right as he's entering Jerusalem. Because if you'll remember, Jesus has just raised Lazarus from the dead. And you remember when the Pharisees, the religious rulers, when they see this, they're upset about it. They know, look, people are going to see Lazarus. They know he was dead for days, and now he's alive. We have got to kill Lazarus, and we've got to kill Jesus before this spreads. And so at that point, the Pharisees, the religious rulers, they intensified their plan and their plot to kill Jesus. And so he had been making enemies a long time, but everything is about to come to a head. And these are Jesus' last few days. Now let me ask you this, and I'd like to get your feedback. Maybe you know for sure, or at least you have an educated guess, but the Jews, the Pharisees especially, they had been looking for a Messiah. I mean, they read the prophets. They had read Amos. They knew that at some point, all nations of the world are going to be brought in. We know there's a Messiah coming. We know that there's a John the Baptist, an Elijah, the spirit of Elijah that's going to make straight the way before the Messiah comes. They had seen it. They had been looking for a Messiah. So then why did they reject Jesus? Why do you think they rejected Jesus? Okay, that very important answer. They didn't understand the nature of the kingdom. You'll remember even Jesus' disciples, right up until his death, didn't understand this. They expected Jerusalem, they expected Judea to be restored. We're going to be a country like we once were. We're going to be in power in the world. We're going to have a king that rules the whole world. And they didn't understand Jesus' kingdom was not of this world, but it was a spiritual kingdom. Okay, and another answer, look at John chapter 11, verse 48. Let's just all turn there, and we'll come right back to Matthew chapter 21. But look at John chapter 11, and somebody read for us verse 48. And this is that last week of Jesus' life, same place we just left off in Matthew chapter 21. So John 11, 48. Okay, have you ever been so comfortable that if you did the right thing, you would lose your comfort? You ever had a job where, look, if I blow the whistle, if I stand up for what's right, I might lose my job. At the very least, I'll burn some bridges. Well, that is a real challenge. Do I do the right thing or do I do the easy thing? And so that's the choice that the Jews, the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees had to make. Look, we don't want to accept Jesus as Messiah because if we do, we'll upset Rome. Rome will come and kick us out. They'll make our life hard. They'll take away our religious seats. And so one reason that Jesus was rejected, not because of disbelief, not even 100% because of confusion, but because of comfort. They said, if we accept Jesus, this Messiah, then we're going to lose. We have a lot to lose. And so Jesus, in this last week of his life, is about to lose his life because some people are scared they're not going to be comfortable. Now Monday. Look at verses, Matthew chapter 21 again. Look at verses 18 through 20. Someone read that for us. Matthew chapter 21, verses 18 through 20. Okay, so Jesus is on his way from a little city, a little town, a little village called Bethany, back into Jerusalem, back towards the temple, back to see people, back to do some teaching. And he's hungry. And I feel like every time I go on a trip with my kids, that's like the first thing they ask for is something to eat. So we got to take snacks or it's going to be a long trip. So maybe in that way, Jesus was no different. This trip makes him hungry. It's a short trip, but he gets hungry. And so a fig tree catches his eye. And as this fig tree catches his eye, he thinks, well, let me use this as an example. Let me see if there's food on this. And so when he approaches the tree, he saw that the fig tree looked like it had the appearance of fruitfulness. But when he gets to it, there's no fruit to be seen. Now, Jesus pronounces a curse on this tree. Now, from everything you know about Jesus, does Jesus seem like someone who can't control his emotions, who cannot control his temper? Does he seem like a hothead? Does he seem like someone who would fly off the handle? Does he seem like someone who would be upset to learn some new information and flip out about it? No, he does not. I was at the Freed Hardeman lectures last week or maybe the week before, and one of the speakers they had in chapel was a former gangbanger and drug dealer and gang member in San Francisco. And he became a Christian. It was a great conversion story. But one thing that he talked about when he became a Christian, he just started reading the Bible, and he was impressed with Jesus' masculinity. He said Jesus was a tough man. Now, he was meek, he was humble, he was lowly, but he didn't ever let anyone shake him. He didn't let someone make him do or say something that he didn't want to do or say. He was in complete control of his emotions, and I think that's true. So if Jesus wasn't mad at this fig tree, look, I thought you were going to give me food. I'm hungry. Let me flip out and curse this fig tree. Well, what was the point of this whole interaction? Why was Jesus cursing this fig tree? Let's keep our place, and let's turn to Micah chapter 7, verse 1. Somebody read that verse for us. Raise your hand if you'll get that. Micah chapter 7 and verse 1. Now, we're all friends here, so it's okay if you read, and even if you mess up, we will still love you. All right. Caleb, again, Caleb gets bonus points. That's 2 for him. All right, and then somebody else get Jeremiah chapter 8 and verse 13. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 13. All right, Hamilton. Hamilton gets 2 as well because he's doing something else. Double duty. All right, so let's look at this and see. Just like with the donkey, there's more there that meets the eye. It's not just transportation, it's humility. It's a claim to kingship, and it's a fulfillment of prophecy. So with this fig tree, there's more than meets the eye. And so let's see what that is. Caleb, if you'll read Micah chapter 7 and verse 1. Okay, and then Jeremiah chapter 8 and verse 13. Okay, so God in the Old Testament and through the prophets uses examples all the time so the people will understand what he's talking about. And in about a dozen or half a dozen of the prophets, Jesus likens the nation of Israel to a grapevine that produces no grapes, or to a fig tree that produces no figs. God in the Old Testament says, look, when I look at Israel, you look great on the outside. Everything looks wonderful. But when I get up to pick the grapes to harvest them, there's nothing there but leaves. When I get to the fig tree to pull down the figs to eat them, there's nothing there but leaves. It might be like Jesus said in the New Testament, you look like whitewashed tombs on the outside, but in the inside are dead men's bones. And so Jesus, as he has this interaction with this fig tree, surely these men of the Bible, surely these Pharisees steeped in the law and understanding the prophets would have understood all throughout Old Testament history, God has likened Israel, when they were sinning, when they were in the wrong, to a fig tree that looks great but produces no fruit. And now what does Jesus come in contact with as he's marching into Jerusalem to teach? A fig tree that looks like it's fruitful but produces no fruit. And so Jesus enacts a curse on this tree, not because he's mad, not because he's lost his cool, not because he's hangry. He never gets out of control of his emotions. There's something more there. Jesus is saying to this tree, to the people around him, when Israel is unfruitful, God curses them. And just like this tree that's unfruitful is being cursed, you as a nation right now are being cursed for what you're doing. So Israel had this appearance of fruitfulness, but they had no fruit. And so their lack of faith, their lack of obedience is going to cause them to wither away. Now, this tree was not what it claimed to be, and neither was the nation of Israel. Now, during this Passion Week and each night, Jesus is going to leave Jerusalem and go into an area called Bethany, at least for the first few nights. And so each week during this Passion Week, he spends the night in Bethany. And we're not told the exact reason he chose Bethany, but can you think of any reasons he might have? Do you remember some of the people that lived in Bethany? You remember that Mary and Martha lived there? And Lazarus, who he had raised from the dead, lived there? You know, we talked about at the beginning, if you only had 1 week, who would you spend it with? Well, those that you loved the most, those that were closest to you, those that you thought needed help for your departure. And so I think that's what Jesus is doing. He's spending time in Bethany. Why leave Jerusalem every day? Well, one reason, to be around the people that he loves. Maybe another reason is this. Bethany is about 2 miles from Jerusalem. So it's close enough to get back and forth easily, but it's far enough away to get a break. You know, you ever have people that you love, that you want to help, but sometimes you just need a little distance from them. You need a night to kind of clear your head. And so it may be that that's why Jesus stayed in Bethany as well. So Bethany, close enough to get to Jerusalem, but far enough away to escape the crowds. Now this is a very powerful verse, or a very powerful section, what's about to happen here. In the section that we'll look at now, Jesus is about to weep over the city of Jerusalem. You remember in Isaiah chapter 53, that is a section that is just a prophecy of Jesus, right? All these different things. And we read that and we look to the New Testament and we see Jesus and we say, yeah, that's him. Yeah, Jesus did that too. Yeah, that describes Jesus. And one of those verses is Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3. And it says this, Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Let me just share a few of the times that Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 32, Jesus feeds 4,000, one of the times that he feeds the multitude. And it says there that he did that because he had compassion on them. In Mark chapter 6 and verse 34, Jesus sees a big crowd and he has compassion on them. In Luke chapter 7 and verse 13, Jesus sees a widow who has just lost her son, and Jesus has compassion on her and raises that son from the dead. In John chapter 11 verse 35, when he's in Bethany visiting Mary and Martha, Jesus weeps because his friend Lazarus has just died. I want to read with you Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 32. And that verse is, this is a command to us. And it says, be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. You know, when we obey this command to be kind to each other, when we obey this command to be tender-hearted, when we obey this command to let compassion move over us, when we obey this command to share someone's grief with them, to be overcome with sadness over some kind of condition, we're only imitating Jesus, our master example. See how tender-hearted the Savior is. He was a man of compassion, a man of sorrows, one that was acquainted with grief. You know, our culture teaches you if you don't get affected over anything, if you're hard-hearted, if you do everything alone, if nothing breaks your heart, if nothing makes you cry, then you're tough. That's what toughness is. That's what maturity is. But that's not what the Bible says. You know, shame on us if we can think about the sick in our community and not care. Shame on us if we can see the widows in the church struggling, barely getting by, not being able to do their yard work, and we don't help. Shame on us if we can look into a community full of children that have no home, have no help, and not be moved with compassion to help them. Well, Jesus was someone, when he saw a need, it broke his heart. He was moved with compassion. Look at Luke chapter 19, verses 41 through 42. And someone read that for us, if you will. Luke chapter 19, verses 41 through 42. And this is something we see in Luke 19. It's a parallel passage to Matthew 21 that we don't see in Matthew 21. So I wanted to bring this out. But Luke chapter 19, someone read verses 41 and 42. So can you imagine this? Jesus, as he walks into Bethany, as he's overlooking the city, he just has to stop for a minute. And he's overwhelmed because he sees the city and he says, man, if you just knew the peace that you could have, but you're rejecting it. And it breaks his heart. And we're told that he wept over the city. Well, why? Because they had rejected him, and he knew how great their life could be. He knew what they could have if they would listen, but too many were rejecting him, and it broke his heart. In Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, Jesus is prophesied as the Prince of Peace. And I like that song. I don't know if you know that song, but a beautiful song. It talks about Jesus being the Prince of Peace. But in Luke chapter 19, verses 41 and 42 that were just read, as he marches towards Jerusalem and as he's going closer and closer to the cross, Jesus weeps because the majority have rejected him, that peace that he came to offer. Now we're told the creator of the world, you know, we read John 3:16 and we're told that God loved the world so much, and we see that God and Jesus loved us in a kind of a corporate sense, loved everyone. But if you look at John chapter 10, verse 3, it says the sheep. Now this is talking about us because it's talking about Jesus as the shepherd. It's talking about his flock, which would include us. And so Jesus says, the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by his name. So I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to say that, yes, God loved the world so much that he sent Jesus for everybody. I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to say that God loved us so much that he sent Jesus for us as an individual. See, Jesus knows us by name. He calls his sheep by their name. And so it's true that Jesus loves the world, but he also loves us as individuals. And Jesus cares about each person, whether they're saved or whether they're lost. And so here, his compassion for Israel and for us now, today, should take our breath away and should move us. Now, look at where Jesus goes when he's done weeping over the city. After weeping over the city, he continues his march towards Jerusalem. You see, he's left Bethany for the day. He's come and he's cursed the fig tree, teaching them, look, don't look like this tree that looks pretty but does nothing. Don't look like Israel that looks great but does nothing. And then he marches on, he sees the city, he cries over it, and now he marches towards the temple to do some teaching. And when he enters the temple, you remember how he finds it? Oh, it's just a lovely house of worship. Everyone is reverent. They're doing exactly what they should, and he's just so impressed. Is that right? Is that right? No, that's not right. Jesus finds the temple being profaned. Unholy things are happening, not reverent worship like we're commanded to do. We're told in Isaiah 56:7 and then Matthew 21:13 here that God's house was a house of prayer, but these people in their perversion have turned it into a den of robbers. Now Jesus in his holiness and in his justice overturns their tables and drives them out of the temple. You know, when we think about business, God is not opposed to business, is he? I mean, God is not opposed with us working to take care of our families, not opposed with us making money. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. But what God is opposed to is us making a profit at other people's expenses, us taking advantage over people, us profaning the holy with the unholy. You know, I don't guess there would be any problem in me promoting a business that I own on the side to you guys outside of this assembly, but I don't know that anyone would be okay with me taking a 5-minute commercial for one of my little side businesses and trying to get you guys signed up. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, we're profaning the holy. This is not the time or the place for that. This isn't the time for someone to make $1 in the worship service when we're thinking about God. But that's what these people were doing. They had turned the holy into something that was unholy. Now, if someone would for us, nice and loud, read Matthew chapter 21 and verse 12. Now, before they read it, does anybody know specifically, and you can look there if you want to, and that'll be fine, what tables did Jesus flip? Now, we know he goes in, and there are money changers. That is, there are people saying, look, if you're from out of town and you don't have the right denomination of money, you come here, and we'll give you the denomination you need for a cut of the money. And then there were also people there that were selling animals that could be sacrificed. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes people would travel far distances to come to the temple, and they needed animals to sell that they could not transport. But what happened more often than not is you would bring your animal in, and people would say, no, that has a freckle on its hoof. You can't offer an animal to God that has a freckle on its hoof. You got to buy this animal from us that's 10 times the normal price. And so they had changed it into a thing of corruption. Okay? But what table specifically is it that Jesus flipped in his righteous indignation? Does anybody remember? Or can you look at Matthew 21:12 and tell me? Okay, the money changers, and then the tables of which animals? All right, the doves, the pigeons. Now, why is this interesting? Anybody know that off the top of your head? Why is it specifically, you think, possibly, that we're told that Jesus flipped the tables of the money changers, but then specifically those who sold pigeons? Why would Jesus care to flip that table in particular? Why not the lambs? Why not the goats? Why the pigeons? Okay, that's exactly right. Someone read for us Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 7. Look at Leviticus chapter 5 and in verse 7. Of course, this is the giving of the law of Moses. And then somebody, while they're turning there, somebody else get for us Luke chapter 2, verses 22 through 24. So who's got Leviticus 5, 7? Okay, we got that. And then who's got Luke 2, 22 through 24? Okay, right here. All right, Leviticus 5, 7.
And if he be not able to bring a lamb, then he shall bring for his trespass, which he has committed, 2 turtle doves, or 2 young pigeons unto the Lord, one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering.
Okay, isn't that merciful of God? He says, look, sin is such a serious deal. It requires a life sacrifice, blood. That's how important sin is. It's not some little thing that you can just gloss over, but something has to die for that sin to be rectified. And we know that Jesus is that offering in the New Testament. But isn't that gracious of God to say, look, if you can't afford a lamb or a goat, I know there are poor people out there, let me give you an alternative, something that's cheaper that you can do. And so he says you can sacrifice a pigeon or a turtle dove if you can't afford a lamb or a goat. Isn't that merciful of God? Now look at Luke chapter 2, or listen to Luke 2, 22 through 24.
And when the days of their purification according to the law of Moses was fulfilled, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as it was written in the law of the Lord. Every man that opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons.
Okay, so Jesus' own parents took advantage of this provision in the law of Moses. They couldn't afford a goat. They couldn't afford a sheep. They were poor, humble people that didn't have a lot of money, and they offered what Moses had said they could do God had said through Moses so long ago. And so could it be that Jesus, who he viewed justice as one of the weightier matters of the law, you remember he told them, you tithe of all the different mints and all these different harvests and all these different things, great, but you're neglecting the weightier things. You're neglecting mercy, you're neglecting justice, you're neglecting faithfulness. And so might it be that Jesus, who viewed justice as one of the weightier matters of the law, flipped the table of the people that were taking advantage of the poor, those who needed the most protecting. You know, I think about our call today to stand up and to protect those that need protecting, and those in our society that have no one to speak up for them, no one to help them. And I wonder how Jesus would have handled that. And this is something that I was impressed with, a friend of mine mentioned, but think about this. We may need to flip tables someday. We may need to flip a table of sorts. You know, you think about some people, their favorite Jesus is the Jesus that went into the temple and flipped the table. And we may need to flip a table someday. But before we do, 2 things that I want us to remember, and I'll mention this and then I'll call on you there. So the first thing I want us to remember before we flip a table of sorts is James chapter 1 and verse 20 tells us that the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. You know, we would be wrong to act out of our own anger, our own interests, and then feign pretending that it were in the interests of God. So before we flip a table someday, make sure that it's on God's behalf and not ours. And then the second thing, and a friend of mine, a preacher, Hiram Kemp, said this. He said, don't flip tables in a community that you haven't wept over. Don't flip tables in a community that you haven't wept over. Where was Jesus right before he went in and cleansed the temple? He was looking at the city crying because they weren't going to be saved. So we need to invest in an area before we go in and do like Jesus did. Yes, sir?
21:12 mentions the table of money changers, but King James Version has the seat of those who sold doves. Is there any significance to mentioning seats? Is that a translation?
I'm not sure. Anyone else know the answer to that? I haven't looked at that specifically. From what I remember from studying this, I don't think there's any difference. I'll try to look into it next week and see if those people maybe stood on some kind of pedestal so that people could see them or something like that, but I'm not sure. But that's a good question, and I'll make a note and we'll look at it. All right, a couple more things, and then we'll be done for today, and I'll give you another chance to make a couple comments before we're done. But in the temple, while Jesus is here, after he flips these tables and after he kind of makes a stand for those that need protecting the most, the blind and the lame come to him to be healed in the temple. And these people were hanging on the words of Jesus. They were listening to him. They were in love with him. They wanted to follow him. They wanted his help at the very least. But we're told in verse 15, and then some of the parallel gospels were told this, but the chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people who saw the wonderful things he did were jealous, didn't want to give up their power, and then they sought to destroy him. And so what is the religious elite? What is the scholars that should have known better? What's their reaction to seeing Jesus do these things, to seeing him heal the lepers? Their reaction is jealousy. Why do people like this guy so much? Why do things have to be done his way? Instead of being humble and obedient, their reaction was jealousy. And so again, Jesus forces these people. He gives them an ultimatum. Accept me as king with the proofs that I've given you, with the evidence that I've shown you, or reject me and kill me. And so that's where we'll leave off for today. Jesus is going to go on Tuesday, which we'll look at next week, Lord willing. And he's going to go and he's going to debate with, he's going to talk to, he's going to teach the different religious groups. And we'll see how his interactions with them eventually lead to them. They can't handle it anymore, and they're going to put him to death. Anybody have any thoughts or questions, maybe something you want to address next week or something you would like to add before we dismiss? All right, thank you so much for your help with reading.